Hello, this is Dr. Victoria Nalule, and I'm the CEO of Nalule Energy and Minerals Consultancy. And in today's webinar, we want to talk about the USA's energy sector and whether it has been impacted by the global energy crisis, and also to explore if the country has taken effective measures to address the global energy crisis. So here with me is Mr. Eric Camp from Texas. And before we start the discussion, I would like Mr. Eric to briefly introduce himself.
Thank you very much for having me, Dr. Nalule. It's very nice to talk to you today. I'm so impressed with all the work that you're always doing and really am grateful for this opportunity. My background, I'm a U.S. trained oil and gas and energy lawyer. I've been practicing for about 14 years now. My undergraduate degree is in political science from Centenary College of Louisiana. I got my Juris Doctorate, my JD, from Southern Methodist University School of Law in Dallas, Texas in 2008. I'm licensed to practice law in Texas and North Dakota. And I'm board certified as an oil and gas mineral law expert by the Texas Board of Legal Specialization. I practice law with the Fort Worth, Texas-based firm of Decker Jones PC. I also do some international petroleum consulting, energy industry consulting with the U.S. Department of Commerce and the World Bank. I'm with the Fort Worth firm, but I actually live in Frankfurt, Germany these days after spending, been here for about 1.5 years. Before that, we were in Africa for 4 years in Kenya and 4 years in Ghana. So I've had the opportunity to see the energy space from the US as well as living abroad. I have to give a disclaimer that these opinions today will be my own and not those of clients or any organization that I've worked with. But I'm very excited to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric, for the introduction. And we have the right experts to take us through the energy sector of the USA. I'm impressed by your background and by all the other countries you've worked with. So to get started, what do you think has been the impact of the global energy crisis on the USA?
That's a big question. It's a big crisis, and there are a lot of different ways that it has impacted the U.S. But to answer it, I think first we have to understand that the energy sector in the U.S. is very different than the rest of the world, and a lot of that comes down to our oil and gas ownership. Most of the world, the vast majority of the world, as you know, it's going to be the federal government that owns the resources under the ground. And so companies that are coming in to develop are doing contracts with the federal government or their ministries, whatever branch, to get access to those resources, which can be a very bureaucratic, time-consuming process. In the U.S., we do have a lot of federal and state-owned lands, but the vast majority of the lands in the U.S. are owned by private citizens. And in the U.S., that means that they also own the resources under the ground. And so in most cases in the U.S., if a company wants to produce oil and gas on private land, they do a simple contract with the landowner, and there are state regulations governing that, but it's a very fast process. You don't have near the red tape that you do contracting with a private citizen that you do with the federal government. So I think that's part of the reason that the U.S. oil and gas industry has been so successful and so large, is that it's easier for companies to do deals. And so that's a key part of our system. I would say that I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but I think that approximately 30% of U.S. oil and gas production comes from federal or state lands, and the other 70% is probably from private lands. And so that's kind of the breakdown of where it comes from. But to put the energy crisis, to really understand its impact on the U.S., you have to look at the total U.S. production. And it's in looking at that you see why relative to the rest of the world, the crisis has been relatively smaller, or much smaller actually, than the rest of the world. There definitely has been an impact on the U.S., but the U.S. is the largest producer of oil in the world. I think the last time I looked, it was around 12 million barrels of oil a day, and the U.S. is the largest gas producer in the world at almost 100, or almost 1,000 BCM per year of gas from the last numbers that I looked at, which is approximately 50% more than Russia as the second largest producer. So when you're the largest producer of oil and gas, and both of those figures are more than the U.S. needs domestically, you're energy independent. And even though the U.S. does import and export, or import, energy from other places, it's so large, that really gives you a lot of insulation, if you will, from global energy prices in the rest of the world. So domestically, the U.S. has the main impacts, I think, have been there. You are seeing higher energy prices around the world, but even still, especially for natural gas, the price in the United States is much less than the rest of the world, maybe $7 per MMBTU. So for many multiples lower than the rest of the world. And so, but you do see the higher energy prices in general, and that has led to higher inflation. And so I think that for the U.S. consumer, they definitely have seen, that the higher energy prices have been carried over into higher inflation rates. There have been opportunities for U.S. producers because the U.S. is either number one or number two in the world, depending on the month, LNG exporter in the world. And so there's been a space there, obviously much larger increased demand for U.S. LNG exports to make up for Russian gas that Europe is not consuming as much. So for the producers, that's been an opportunity. But at the same time, the U.S. is a boom and bust industry. The U.S. oil and gas industry has been boom and bust over the years. And in the past, when you saw really high prices, U.S. companies would go out and produce a lot very quickly, and they can do it very quickly because of fewer regulations. But in the last downturn, so many investors in the U.S. oil and gas sector were burned when prices tanked. Many companies went bankrupt. Many stockholders and banks lost a lot of money. So the stakeholders today are really preaching staying within their cash flow. So even when prices gotten really high in the energy crisis, you haven't seen U.S. producers, really drill as much as they possibly could, because their stakeholders are telling them, look, we like these high prices. Don't kill it by overproducing. And so that's why you've kind of seen relatively stable prices, I think, throughout the crisis so far. They went up real quick, but they've been kind of relatively stable since then. So I think the biggest impact has been, higher energy prices, but not nearly as much as the rest of the world. And then that's led to inflation. But in the big scheme of things, it hasn't been nearly as bad as other places.
All right. Thank you very much, Eric, for that. And you've raised very important questions, which actually is in a way give us answers to the next question as to how the U.S. has been, whether it has been able to respond to the energy crisis in an effective way. You've mentioned that the oil producers, they haven't been under pressure to drill based on the prices. So it has been a little bit strategic based on what they faced in the past, especially during the 2020, when most of the oil companies when the oil prices hit negative and most oil companies went into bankruptcy. So besides strategically drilling at a level that will not jeopardize their cash flow, which other measures have been taken in the U.S. to respond to the global energy crisis?
That's another great question. But to answer it, you have to, I think, start with where was the U.S. at the beginning of the crisis, and that impacts what you have to do to respond to it. And when you're already very energy independent, you're making different choices than the countries that are having their energy sources effectively cut off. So I think that really one of the effective measures they did was be prepared and be very independent, energy independent at the beginning of the crisis, so that they were insulated from some of the worst impacts. Some of I mentioned that inflation and high energy prices, particularly maybe in the first 6 months of the energy crisis. When gasoline prices get high in the U.S., that really affects consumers, and it's almost like an additional tax on people. And so the administration did a number of releases from what we call the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, basically massive amounts of gasoline and oil that the U.S. government keeps for times of crisis. Those are maybe short-term solutions, because we just consume so much gasoline in the U.S. that even 100 million barrel release is not many days worth. So I think it's one of the things that the U.S. is doing effectively is not going back on the U.S. is not going back on allowing the export of our resources. It wasn't very long ago that the U.S. didn't allow for oil and gas to be exported because we weren't energy independent, and we were importing so much that we couldn't afford to allow people to export. And so when prices spiked, there were some calls for the U.S. to curtail allowing that oil and gas to be exported. At the same time, you have calls saying our allies need these energy resources, and so I think that the government did a good job of getting our allies the resources that they needed, and it was our consumers and industry could deal with higher prices in the short term. It's also a challenge because in our decentralized system in the U.S., the government can only do so much. I mean, they can't tell the producers to stop producing. They can't tell them to produce more. They can incentivize or slow down production on federal lands. And there's been some of that from this administration, because another priority that they're weighing is the U.S. Global climate change obligations. And so there have been some increased environmental regulations on federal lands, and maybe there's been an increase in royalty rates on federal lands, so increasing the government share of the revenues. But in terms of really increasing or decreasing the size of the production or consumption quickly, the government can't do much. And so it's not like an OPEC state, for example, where the National Oil Company can say, we're going to set the price here, and we're going to produce, 50% more or 50% less next year. The government just doesn't have that kind of power in the U.S. So even if especially in something that's not necessarily a domestic crisis, I think the government response is not going to be particularly overwhelming. So I think the government's trying to manage a lot of different things, with helping the allies, helping the U.S. consumers, allowing the industry to go forward, but in a cleaner way, and also trying to meet the climate change obligations.
All right, thank you very much, Eric. So this brings us to the end of our session, since it's a short session, but we've noted very important things regarding the USA's energy sector, which are totally different from other sectors, including the ownership of resources, where the private people do own the resources. We're also seeing the government control and also the strategy to ban exporting the products, especially if they are needed in the country. I wish more countries can do that and be strategic on when is the right time for them to export, because I think most countries that do have the resources, especially in the global south, they should be energy independent like the US, but in most cases, they opt to export their resources. So we have learned a lot from your session, and we hope to host you again because there are various other issues that would definitely need to explore, including the issue of regionalism or regional cooperation, how the US has been able to support its allies. So I think those are some of the issues that we can explore in future. But for now, this is the end of the webinar, and I encourage our viewers to subscribe to the YouTube channel, and also feel free to reach out to Mr. Eric Camp anytime because he has given us a detailed discussion about the USA's energy sector. Eric, thank you very much for honoring the invitation.
Absolutely, my pleasure, and I'm looking forward to doing it again, hopefully very soon.
Definitely, I'll host you again. Thank you very much, and have a lovely day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.